The latest White House COVID-19 report shows some slight improvements in Georgia's ranking against other states. We're right in the middle of the pack when it comes to the number of new cases. Today we have 963 new cases, according to DPH. Georgia's test positivity rate is also close to 6%. That's up slightly. Georgia ranks toward the bottom of states when it comes to the number of people in the hospital, with more patients here needing serious treatment than in other states. Right now, there are about 1,200 people in the hospital with COVID-19. Georgia also among the states still battling with a large number of COVID deaths. 32 more people have died from the virus since yesterday.